Okay, welcome to our first week's literary reading for this year. My name is Natasha Saye, and I thank you for being here. This is just a nice size for the readers and for me. Tonight we have two readers. Each will read for about 20 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A and discussion. Please be aware that we're recording this event, and the recording will be available through the Poetry Series website in a week or so. So I'll start by introducing Sadie Hoagland, who Westminster is lucky to have teaching this semester. She's the author of a collection of stories, American Grief in 4 Stages, and a novel new this year, Strange Children. Her masterful short stories are distinguished by a wide range of tones, plots, and time periods. Her novel consists of first-person stories in the voices of 8 teenagers affiliated with a polygamous community in Utah. Strange Children is riveting. I couldn't put it down. Not only do the characters change over the course of the novel, but many of their actions are simultaneously shocking and believable. And there is a tour de force etymological chapter. Sadie earned degrees from Middlebury College, the University of California at Davis, and the University of Utah, and she is an associate professor at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. She's also a facilitator for Narrative 4, a global organization driven by artists, shaped by educators, and led by students, using stories to change the world. I look forward to hearing more about that after the reading. Welcome, Sadie.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to Westminster for hosting me, and for Shane. I'm so honored to be reading with you. I can't wait to hear your reading as well. So yeah, I feel very grateful to be teaching at Westminster this semester. I'm having a lot of fun. So, okay. I'm going to read from both the story collection and the novel, just a very small snippet from American Grief in 4 Stages, which is a collection that thinks about grief and trauma as this kind of space where language fails us and where the logic of a narrative really isn't available to us. So the story I'm going to read is called Origins. Quite short. She was in the gas station bathroom, her mother and brother waiting outside by the car, not waiting the way she imagined, still and huddled like horses in the cold, breaths bursting from their nostrils, or now wolves, feet pawing the ground. While she looked down at the paper-clogged toilet and the stones that had fallen out of her. Ruddy, brown, smoothed dull by her 13 years, she dared not flush. Later, her mother would take her to the doctor to learn she would always be small, her pelvis broken even by a simple wish for a child, and so she would remain childless. And her mother would say, "We'll start a rock collection." This phrase, a substitute for her own broken heart, burying phantom grandchildren already. Tiny graves, though, the size of a finger poked in the dirt to make a hole for 3 sister seeds. Corn, bean, now squash. And had she not already done that 100 seasons? But her daughter had not. Each month, she threw the stones away out of her pocket on walks to school, in the trash. She tendered other things. Squirrel on the feeder, rabbit she fed sugar to from a Dixie cup on the back porch that her brother eventually shot. She buried it and considered the tiny teeth that had nibbled at the thick skin of her thumbprint. It was not so thick, her skin, and so she resolved to toughen it. Black leather, jagged hair, bottles, boys, men even. But this neither could keep her from a truth. Not of the stones, but of the place they had come, that bathroom, that place, to discover there were a million ways to be a mother except for her. Its dinge, promise of vagrants, smell of bleached shit. She felt like that. Childless always, and now a junkie, like the rabbit's bones under the dirt, rotten, body stretched thin by needles until, how long will a rabbit live unshot? There are lots of ways to grow up, to become man or woman, and this was one. Even as her pelvis refused to ripen. Did she try to quit? She must have. Her brother, rabbit killer, her brother had 2 pink babies before he was even 20. They gummed her fingers, left them wet, pulled the studs in her ears, stretched her lobes, reminded her what clean meant, what mother meant, what wasn't hers. So she didn't quit. And when she had had enough, she had too much, heavy hit, and she was back there squatting over the toilet that her mother had told her was too dirty to touch. Her own body too dirty to touch, the stones crumpled into her blood, sooty blood, heavy blood. And now the shapes of meager horses gather, small clouds of cold breath in the night. And she, the wolf, so tired, the wolf. Okay, and now I'm going to read from Strange Children, which, as Natasha mentioned, takes place in a polygamous community and is the story of the community sort of struggling through the eyes of its coming of age characters. There are 8 narrators, and the sort of plot mechanism of the novel is that 2 of these narrators, Jeremiah and Emma, a 16-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl, they fall in love and they break religious law, and he's kicked out and goes to the city, and she's married off to his father. She gives birth to his father's child a year later. He commits a crime that then turns to unravel the community. So sort of starts this chain of events that unfold. 2 of the sort of central characters are Emma, who I just mentioned, and her older sister, Anna Lou. And Anna Lou has kind of a different trajectory through the book than Emma, but I'm going to read the first section, her first narration, so you don't need to know much going into this. She'll kind of describe the community for you, other than that they also have a brother named Levi. Anna Lou. It's hard to say when things started to go bad for the whole brethren. No plague came down like in the book. There was no locust, no blood on the doors. No, it just eventually became clear that things had gone all rotten, and even as we thought it, the orchids turned all sour, and the sick, sweet smell of softening and bruising apples hung about everywhere. But even with this smell, no one could name any one thing that was unholy, and in a land of God's people and with only his words, no one knew how to say that things were going bad until they had already gone that way. But it's not hard to say when things got bad for me. That's easy to say. It was the day that someone came to tell me the prophet wanted to see me after all. I was born with a limp, and this is an inconvenience in most ways. It was like my right leg had gone straight from the womb to the grave, so stiff and straight and dead is it. Even the skin is cold to touch. But I learned to walk just the same as any other child learns, only with a limp, on account of having to use my leg like it was wood instead of flesh. And so it's not always been easy, and it's not always made me feel believing about the light of God and the general state of fairness in the world. One thing about a limp in a congregation like ours is that it keeps you from being married off at 14 or even 12 after the prophet went to loosing the standards of God, which now I suppose is a good thing. But when I was 14, it just made me feel unwanted and unusable, like I could never get to helping in the numerating of God's people. Though I always did like that it kept me around to keep up for Emma and Mama, and I suppose it was true that it was good, though I used to dream of being somewhere else, where work was not life, but instead we had things like television, which I used to dream about in the dark. And I did think that if we had a box of light like the ones I'd seen pulsing in the windows of town, and if we could see the whole world in it, things might be different, maybe better. And even though my pa said television wasn't magic, I couldn't see how a picture of people in one place going up into space and bouncing back down somewhere else at almost the same time could be anything else, really. And I imagined if I had a television, I could see in it a picture of a girl with a limp like mine, going about her day like me, but somewhere else. And I could watch her and know I was not alone. And everyone else would know I was not alone neither, in my gait. And even though now I know there is no such other girl, back then I thought she would have made my limp mean something better than it did in a place where there is a history of limps, and it is not pretty to tell. Other children had been born with limps, and in harder times they just died outright by some way or some hand, owing to the logic that when a cow or a horse is born with a limp, they are just slitted straight off soon as they take their first stupid steps and let it be known what they got. But now, for want or gain of mercy, and I've never been quite sure which, children born in that state are left to live and limp their whole life through. This reprieve is partly owing to Alice Parley Smith, who, like me, was also born with a limp, and who was convinced her leg was dead because the devil himself lived in the flesh, and at times was able to take over the rest of her body and drive her to some terrible doings. People around Redfield became afraid of Alice Parley Smith and the devil within her, so I guess they never thought about holding another limping child's head in the trough again, which is what Levi told me they used to do. So I suppose I should thank Alice. But she managed to kill her own nephew and that child's kitten all in one day, just before she died, and so I do not thank her, because now people look at my leg and the crooked tread I leave, and I swear the hair of their own neck stands up for the fear of the devil they saw in Alice, and the devil they think they see in my own stone flesh. Because Alice did blame that leg for her taking her paring knife to the child's throat when he was stupid enough to ask his aunt to please sew a button on his pants so his mother wouldn't find out he'd lost it and whip him. They say the boy held the kitten as he asked, a calico barn thing with fleas and big eyes like they all have, and Alice looked up from her slicing of peaches for pie making and asked to see the kitten. They say it was quick, the way she moved, with the dead flesh of her leg and the devil in it rising up to her face, and even her eyes turned the cold gray of gone life, as she stabbed that kitten through its tiny ribs and into its walnut-sized heart, and bits of peach still on the knife were then stuck to the kitten's fur, so that the fatal wound was so irresistible to lick by the other barn cats that the kitten's body had to be burned right off before the boy, whose turn was next and equally as quick, was even in the ground. And when he was in the grave and everyone looked at Alice, she just looked at her leg and smiled this sad little smile, and so was deemed unfit to die atone, and so was left alone to be punished by God in his time, though children never did ask her for anything ever again. And while I am glad not to have been drowned at birth, I do not thank her because the children never asked me for anything either, like I was her, and I wish they would. Also, I do not thank her because 2 months after Alice finally died, when I was only 11, I was out working in the pen, feeding the pigs and the chickens and doing my work as I always did, when Levi pushed me down from behind so that I was on my stomach in mud, and he put his foot on my back, and I saw the shadows of some of the other boys who were getting big but who were not yet men. And Levi pushed down on my back, and another boy, Daniel, put his palm on my head and pressed until my face sank into the mud, and the mud began to cover my mouth and nose. I could not breathe almost at all. Levi breathed down harder then, and I really couldn't breathe with all his weight on me and my face in the mud. And he said, "Don't you ever try anything like Alice Parley Smith, Annaloo, because if you do, if you ever try to kill any of us like that, we will burn you, and the devil that lives in your leg will go back to hell." And then just before I lost all breath and light, he let up and they walked away and left me. So I do not thank her. This was all hanging around my life, all these things like a harvest smoke when things started to go bad. And I was trying my best to hold down our side, my mama's side of the family. Emma was in all kinds of red-headed trouble with Jeremiah, the son of her betrothed, and was sneaking around thinking I did not know. And I had blonde hair and blue eyes, and so was my mother's angel, she said, but still Mama was worried about her daughters and sons and wanted to keep us close. We were hardly allowed off the yard alone unless we were with someone for some fear of hers I did not understand. It was true that boys had been disappearing, like they had been ghost children that do not die nor live on either when they are grown. They just left and no one asked about it. Generally, it was said the prophet would tell the father to tell the son to leave, on account of the fact that with the girls all being the fourth and fifth wives of the older men, it would be a while before it swung back around to first for any of these boys. But this was not the usual way, and there was a dissettlement about it buzzing in the air, and my leg began to ache, to stir a little in its fleshy grave, like some big storm was coming, though I knew August to be hot and dry. And then one day it did rain. A hot, quick storm came in from the desert to the west. My mama and Emma and I all stood in the barn for shelter and watched it come down like some brief and passionate gesture of God's hand. Emma wanted to dance in the rain, but Mama looked at her once and said she'd like to get a fever and die for that kind of acting. It began to let up when Daniel, the prophet's son, who had, since holding my face into the mud, grown up to 15, same as me, appeared. He came through the west field, the afternoon sun coming out behind him and shadowing his fence post figure as we watched him closer. "Who is that?" Emma asked. And I thought it was Daniel by the way he walked heavy on his heels, and we stood under the barn and waited for our visitor, even though the rain was right near gone. Daniel was soaked and cold, but trying to act like he was neither when he came to us and looked straight at me. "Prophet wants to see you, Annaloo. Come now." "Your pa's already talked to him." Daniel swung his jaw like he was chewing grass, but there was nothing but these words in his mouth. I looked at my mama to see if what he said about Pa was true or if she knew about it, but she did not look back at me and looked down instead. That's when my mouth felt like it was full of flour, and I nodded, but as I went to follow him best I could with that way I walked, I thought of Alice Parley Smith and wondered if the prophet had decided, with the help of God, to kill me now before the devil rose out of my leg and into my body, or to maybe send me off like the missing boys into the desert. And so with these thoughts, I turned and looked at Mama and Emma and saw that they too had fear in their eyes, and Emma ran out into the wet sunshine then like she was going to stop me. But Daniel turned back around and looked at her, and she stopped and looked at the footprints in the mud between us. We'll be watching the road for you, which is what we women always said to each other when one was going out, but this time Emma said it to Daniel instead of me and said it fierce, but he just snorted and kept walking, so I started again to follow my way. The prophet lives always in the big house at the end of town, and all roads lead to it because right next to it is the gathering house and the temple. The prophet always lives in this house until he dies, and the next prophet moves in. But this last time, the new prophet was the old prophet's son, so he'd already moved in to take care of his sick father. The new prophet is not supposed to be the old prophet's son, but the new prophet had insisted on this, and so much did he proclaim it as the word of his father and God that there was fear in choosing another prophet. So he moved in and took his father's seat next to the throne of God and started changing rules right off. I thought about this as we walked because watching Daniel's back from behind, which was hunched over from having grown too fast, I remember I wondered if he would do what his father had done, and I hoped he wouldn't, because looking back 2 years later, I think that when a son followed his father into that seat next to God, I think that's when the trouble really started. When we got to the prophet's house, Daniel made me stand on the porch while he told his father I was there, and I waited for what seemed like a while and watched the whole world shine and dry in the sun while the clouds unmade themselves from the sky. There were sparrows making a to-do about drying their feathers and chirping like something grand had just happened in that summer storm. I watched them and felt things might be all right, but then the screen door swung open and Daniel nodded that it was time, and he held the door for me and pointed to the back parlor room, where I limped slowly as the screen door shut, and I saw that Daniel stayed outside on the porch. I had never been in this house. It was a place where men communed, and I was surprised how dark it was and by the smell of cedar on everything. In the back parlor, the prophet, our youngest one ever, but still an older man, a little older than my father, was standing by the windows, his arms folded and gazing out, like the word of God might come at any time from the sky or those noisy sparrows. Anna Lou, he turned and said, I have had a revelation. His voice was as human as they come. That's one thing to be noted about prophets. I have decided it would be best for you, as pretty a girl as you've turned out. And he walked toward me then and motioned me for come into the room farther, so that I had to swing my dead leg over the edge of a rug and drag it into the center of the room. It would be better, and the prophet touched my blonde rope of hair then, if you were wed into God's house after all, and so I will wed you, and you will be among my wives, and you will be raised up by this union, and thus spared a life without an opportunity to please God and do his duty. And his hand fell onto my breast, and I saw how old his hands were, and I stood staring at the prophet and ate my lip a little and did not say anything. He smiled at me then, and I wondered what it was about this man that made me care so little about God and my duty. And now this is when God's own prophet must have read this in my eyes, and so this is when things went bad for me. This all happened fast, and I warn you that I want to tell it even faster because of the way things like this like to stay unsaid unless spit out of the mouth like a loosed tooth. The prophet had his hands on my shoulders then, as if to show me what he had just told me about becoming his wife, and I was afraid then partly because of his words, but mainly because of his hands and the inevitable truth they were telling as he moved them to my hips, and that was the truth that I had escaped for 3 years but would no longer. The prophet looked at me with his black eyes like he did not see me, and he put his hands around my back and put his mouth over mine, and he tasted like old milk and smelt like cedar just like the house, and I wanted to laugh at how surprised I was, but not a happy laugh, rather just a sound of helplessness. Then he pulled me toward him, and what happened then was I lost my balance. I fell then into my own crippled fate because my leg was stuck behind me at an angle I could not stand on, and so that in falling I went right into the arms of the prophet just as I wanted to push away. It is the word of God, he said, and he lay me down on a dusty old couch, and I heard the sparrows outside, all hallelujah still, and so closed my eyes. I was back in the mud then, but on my back this time, laid there by the prophet of God himself, and it was him pressing his weight down on my body, pulling at my dress, pulling off my underthings, the garments sticking on my straight leg that would not free them, and my face not in the mud, but still I could not breathe as I felt his fingers dry as paper on my face, and my eyes still closed shut, and the sparrows still singing yellow, as he did what he felt to do because I would be his wife, and when he was finished, he got up off of me and smiled. I did not want to look at him, but did not want to look away like some kick dog either. So I saw when his eyes fell on my leg. What I saw is something like scorn come into his face, or maybe even disgust, as he looked at my poor stiffened leg, blue as it is for lack of blood. And I saw this look on the face of the prophet of God. And for the first time ever, not only did I understand Alice Parley Smith, but I also felt the devil inside that leg, keeping me from some shame, wanting everything to burn. And for the first time ever, I let it rise up toward my heart and let it give me the strength to push myself up from that couch, shake the white underthings off that poor leg, straighten myself and walk out of the prophet's house and past Daniel and back down the road where Emma would be watching for me, all with nothing but air under my dress, while those white underthings lay still on the floor of the prophet's house, left by the devil and waiting to be picked up by the hand of God. Thank you.
Yeah, we can unmute ourselves so you can hear. That was so powerful. A lot of powerful chapters in that book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shane McCrae's poems always leave you asking, how did he pull that off? By that, I refer to content that interrogates race in the United States, oral effects that make the poems a pleasure to read, and structures that call upon literary airs, including the Divine Comedy in Paradise Lost. The ending of his poems often make you gasp. The intellect never overshadows the complicated feelings. Shane's recent books weave together the story of Jim Limber, a mixed race boy who lives with Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, with the speaker's own recollection of endemic racism and its contradictions and its sorrows. For his 9 books, Shane has received a Lannan Literary Award, a Whiting Writers Award, an Anisfield-Wolf Book Award, fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the NEA, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. He lives in New York City and teaches at Columbia University. Welcome, Shane. So happy to hear you read.
Thank you for that introduction and for inviting me to read, and thank you, Sadie, for reading that really wonderful work. I'm just gonna get right into it. I'm gonna start with I guess my most recent poem. I kind of finished it a few days ago, and it's called "The Staggering Man," and it is after a drawing by Bill Traylor. That it doesn't have a title, but it is usually known as Man Carrying Dog on Object. So this is The Staggering Man. I wear the anvil and the dog. I carry them, the dog atop the anvil. You might think the anvil a cocked basket, me an African carrying water home from the well, the river, in a basket on my head. It is an anvil, cast steel, painted blue like water. I walked past the river in a dream once, walked along the river carrying the anvil. When I looked and saw my shadow on the water, where the blue anvil, its shadow, should have been, nothing. The shadow of the dog floating above my head. I wake sweating, afraid, too eager, and I check the corner of the still black room immediately for my burden. I leap from bed and reach for the anvil. The dog bites through my hand before I can pull it back, though I had felt the cold pouring from the steel and the wet heat of the dog's breath. As you can see, I hold a cane in one hand, balance the anvil with the other. Now which hand for which? Joy distracted me. To have dreamed such a dream, to have survived it, my burden disappeared. But I arrived at the answer. With the healthy hand, I keep my burden safe, and with the cane I hold in the wounded hand, I punch my dripping blood into the earth. This, all of this is, except for that one, because that one's too new. All of this is from a book of mine that was just taken, and so will hopefully be out in a few years, called The Many Hundreds of the Scent. This is the fungus called Dead Man's Fingers. It's true, the fungus does look like a dead man's fingers. Look at a picture of the fungus if you don't believe me. Or a dead woman's, it's true. If how we think the dead man died was he was murdered and he reaches from the heart of the earth imploring. Or it might as well be the heart of the earth, 6 feet below the surface, for how clear the grave is when I try to picture it. How clear the heart where men lie is. If he was killed by love, once love, said it was love, not the love that packed the body in the heart of the earth, not the last love that informed or instigated the concern to see the body buried, to see the gray cheeks blushed before the grave winch married it to the earth, not the love at the beginning of the chain of undoing being, love waving at itself and us, of the chain of not revivifying, but of gesturing toward life, a burying love, but a love that hides in the crowd at the funeral, its face small, like the face of a boy, cross-armed, sitting in a plastic chair in the hall outside the murmuring door, with the boy who punched him, small but powerfully alone now. How a boy will use his wound to make his way in the world, like an impossible omnidirectional red carpet now unfurling backward through time, from the theater to the limo, from his future loves to his eyes swollen shut. If we imagine it was love that killed the dead man, said it was love, whose fingers reach from the heart of the earth toward you, the dead man is a woman and you know her. I got really fixated for some reason some months ago on the idea that I could rescue some of the poems I wrote when I was in grad school, because I hadn't put any of them in any of my books and I hadn't published any of them. But for some reason I wanted to go back to them. And so I rewrote a bunch of them in syllabics, which is not ordinarily how I write. Ill-advisedly, they're basically all about Greek mythology, although they are all the rewriting of myths. But this is one of them. This is called Penelope and the Watching Fire. She burned the loom each night for heat, but each morning it returned whole and draped with a restless blue fabric, a wave's skeleton. The first few mornings it appeared, she was surprised by the wave. She had publicly vowed she would not lay eyes upon the sea until her husband, who even as she spoke her vow, perhaps lay drowned in the sea, returned. And soon she came to believe the wave was sent to her by the god of waves to torment her. One of her suitors, an attractive man but too young, had told her as her husband's slaves cleared breakfast from the room of the blinding of the Cyclops by no man, whom she was sure was her husband. Perhaps the bones with which she wove were his. Perhaps she would not see him again, but instead would labor always, her fingers bloodying the blue threads at the machine of her husband's bones. And so she thought of him, long years into his absence, as his slaves stuffed the loom, its hollow parts, the gaps in its workings with straw, as she watched them bend, who could not choose how to use their strength. This will, as a way of introduction, when I was 3 years old, I was kidnapped from my father by my mother's parents, which will explain the next 4 poems. And I didn't see him again for 13 years. So this is In the Ditch Where the Camera Finds My Body. I'm splashing in the driveway in a ditch in which a corpse of rain has gathered. Here, a corpse has gathered. Wearing nothing, a full diaper. I am 3. A clear sky leans as if upon a bar upon the house and everyone in the picture, my grandmother, me. I am the rain come down. My mother's parents have just kidnapped me. I am the corpse in which I play. I'm dancing in the corpse. The clear sky sickens, watching, but with no clouds in the sky can't move away. Behind me, picking flowers, my mother's mother sees. The green has fled the leaf. Oh, reader, listener, stay. You are now evidence. This is after my grandparents kidnapped me, they moved to a new development. The only scenes I know are scenes my mother's parents thought to take pictures of. Me in the ditch, my mother's father in the yard before the fence was built, before the lawn was fitted to the earth's face like a face after a mauling. He is posing like a hunter in the dirt. He grips a hoe and kneels in the corpse called everywhere. A neighborhood is coming. Where an armed man kneels and grins, that man will build a house. This is explaining my appearance in certain pictures. In pictures now, I do not smile and didn't then. I would laugh if I was being tickled, and sometimes one, my mother's mother, would tickle me, and the other would take the picture, my mother's father. And so sometimes I'm not smiling, but I'm laughing, my eyes closed and my mouth open, almost like I'm screaming, but I'm laughing. When I was a child, in pictures with my kidnappers, with one, my mother's mother, always her. I'm sitting most often in her lap, her arms around my blurred waist. She has me on Ritalin, and the trick is wait until the laughing stops. As the mouth closes, you can take the smile. And this is the last of these. It's called In the House from Which I Was Kidnapped. And I always feel like I have to introduce this because I always think I'm going to pronounce the word in a way that will make it sound like the word gift, as in a present, but it is the word GIF, as in the digital file. In the house from which I was kidnapped. The pale blinds rise and fall, a GIF forever. The blinds move on their own. At first, my father stands with the string between his fingers, first and middle, pulling even after it tears into his fingers, tears the first and middle skin, him pulling, letting go, his blood staining the length of the looped string nearest him. He pulls the string for years. Eventually, he backs away from the window into the room. He doesn't turn. Now he watches from a shadow in the room for a small child to be returned to him. I see him watching from deeper in the shadow whenever I look into his eyes. The shadow grows the way a child grows. So after January 6th, on January 8th, I guess, I wrote this poem called Hex, which is kind of long and which I'm going to read last. And I enjoyed writing it quite a bit, but I couldn't figure out how to make it any longer, and I couldn't figure out how to write in the same way until some weeks later. And then I wrote a few poems called After Hex, and I'm going to read 2 of those, and then I'm going to read Hex. And they are, the 2 After Hex poems are numbered according to the order in which they were written. So this is After Hex 3. One's opportunities to be unhappy are one's single-most inheritance, all other unities requiring acknowledgement of pendant interests. It's a miracle to whom, what person, you're still alive. The city is an alphabet of numbers. Those past 26, a sudden never-ending and boundlessness, but once so short and narrow, you sang it as you smashed toy trains together, the sneering green engine smashing into the blue engine that really smiled. How useful, but how really useful. Reverse nostalgia of the unfamiliar grid, becoming home. All comfort is decay. The city, you're sure, is not a living thing because it gets harder as it decays, more fatal where there's less of it, until it's gone and all at once not fatal, in hills you once imagined, green hills cushioned soft, upon which you imagined you would lay a gingham blanket, a wicker basket, then from the latter pull a cartoon sandwich and a cartoon slice of pie on a white plate, life a cartoon, the world, except the slice itself is plastic, a dog's chew toy, your dog's toy. It matches neither world exactly, not the cartoon world you when you were a child imagined, and not the world, the wrong, colors in the cartoon, the texture of the colors wrong, no life in the world, no life at all. But in the cartoon, it's too much of the world and all the life in the world, the plastic pie. All comfort is decay. And you have spent your middled life searching for the turkey leg the greedy wolf pulled last from the basket in the cartoon, after watching which your imagination then developed almost without your input. You searched passively, it's true. You sat at the dining table in the afternoon. And who are they, this family? You want to say arisen, but you want to say they manifested like moaning spirits in a bog. Uncertain where you got the image from, every Thanksgiving you have sat at the festoon table in the afternoon, a bib from the Red Lobster in the heart of the next town over, around your neck, knife in one hand, fork in the other, and licked your maw exactly like the greedy wolf, as if your hunger were a spell you cast on the food. But never has the cartoon turkey leg appeared, the perfect brazen turkey leg you've hungered for since you were small. When you first saw the brazen leg drawn steaming from the picnic basket like a sword drawn steaming from the entrails of your enemy. This is After Hex 1. One's opportunities to be unhappy are dynamic, ever expanding. A Ford Mustang chasing the sun as it sprints panicked to the western limit, which is the first day you don't think of the insurrection. And for weeks afterward, and following what once had seemed, and anybody would have said so, seemed to have been a sequence of events in time, and only to the intelligentsia, then hidden. Now they scurry from one nimbus to another down the block until they disappear in darkness. Then they reappear in light, then disappear again in darkness. And then finally, beneath the next street light, they're gone. They disappear in light. To whom what seemed to you a sequence was a sphere of time, expanding in a space with limits and with walls at its limits, in which objects are attacks, the space pays to what authority? The sphere of the riot for what seemed like weeks, but it was only minutes. The sphere was conveyed, a polished gem from hand to hand, one representative to the next, one party to the other, in the weeks of their competitive expressions of concern, in the minutes of those weeks, rolling a golden coin across scarred knuckles, a magician or a criminal, but both. The coin, a sphere in the space between two hands, a coin in the hand. Eventually, like bullets in America, the riot passes through our heads and we forget the riot, everything. What once seemed strange to you becomes your heart, American. Your heart's blood strange to you, hidden in you, the truest part of you unknowable, a minotaur of the hidden God who is not you, the God, not even of your own heart. And this is the last one I'm going to read. And it's called Hex. It's a little long. One's opportunities to be unhappy are unlimited, or limited, but only by one's own imagination, which is powerful but fragile, is defenseless, but is limited only by things unseen. As Bark Psychosis did it in music, At the start of the new music, Hex itself the start of the new music, after Talk Talk started it, who after This Heat started it, who after Public Image Limited, though John Lydon has since gone bad, or more offensively is who he always was, who after Public Image Limited started it, going bad, and not to mention Slint, not to mention the Americans, Lydon and Morrissey gone for, or in Americans, America, for Trump or in Los Angeles, bad. Morrissey, not even new, was never new, except his talent was, and Johnny Mars, and always the dead old art will suffer further life if new artists of irresistible ability work to extend it. Though such artists must not seek to extend the dead old art, or they will fail, but must make only what they must make. And if it aligns with the dead will live again in what they make. Low strings and keening dissonances where the strings ascend together, sirens of the cops inside, their wooden bodies, their brown bodies. Listen, first, the sirens come from nowhere in the world except for them. For them, the sirens come, announcing nowhere. And then the lights from nowhere round the corner, red like an idea of fire, as the drums roll beneath the strings, a shopping cart from far from where it rolls beneath the city, on a sidewalk in the day, in the middle of the city, roll beneath the city the strings from which the sirens come, the lights that chase the sirens down, and live as an idea of fire, and nowhere no guitars. But space and stillness where guitars would be. Stillness and space, and a boy singing his lone unhappiness in the midst of the raw world, to whom I would escape. From the midst of the raw world, its now oppressive stillness, and its windowless disease, its timelessness, its nothing's happening in my life. I don't have time to be dead. Where? To run from timelessness. In the windowless room, in the room in which you sealed yourself at the start of the pandemic, hoping for more life, more time. As Bark Psychosis did it at the start of the new music and made a sound to which one wanders from life and in which one wonders still, having arrived. One's opportunities to be unhappy are unlimited, though often lately limited by the end of the world. But maybe the end of the world is ending. Maybe soon one will be in small ways sad again. One's opportunities available to one's attention, Lydon's to the horseman whinnying himself on the fetid, bloating horse, long since afraid to kick his spurs and pop it, but he makes an eager whinnying, hoping to sound ready. He is ready to be the last American, Winnie and Hex and Winnie. Hills unfurl beneath him to the hills, beneath the surface of Lake Erie and the ice above the hills that seems to constitute the lake from somewhere other than the lake, to be a picture of a dead lake, the surface of the thing, a picture of something else. How far we travel now to be in the now impossible presence of things to which we ride in light that touches and is never touched, all things by anything, us, even in the light. How far we travel, we have traveled to watch the lake unmoving from the parking lot, approaching the moment the moment was already in our minds accomplished, the long visionary gaze across the ice, in the midst of which the gaze, the ice, infinite, has no midst, no middle, but is made of middles echoing. In the midst of the gaze, the moment through which, the visionary moment, we will leave our bodies gazing, or at least our minds, for once won't trouble what we see, such peace accomplished. We have known our peace accomplished on the drive to the lake, and by the time we reach the lake, we've turned around already in our minds, such peace accomplished and retreated from, except we park, except we gaze at the white expanse and sigh, not knowing which emotion demands the sigh, and the sigh leaves us, staggering, a butterfly, our frozen breath, as butterflies have staggered, you have watched them, seemed uncertain where to land, upon which flower. You've watched a butterfly choosing, Or if it wasn't choosing, still it seemed to choose, a flower patterned like itself, our breath escaping in the haze of its occasion. You watch yours disintegrate and do not recognize yourself. But I am watching, and I see you breathing, and watching, I can't see beneath the picture of awe on your face, the image of the visionary moment. And even if it isn't happening beneath the image, I forgive myself for feeling nothing, no visionary moment, seeing yours. And the hills roll beneath the surface of the lake, as Mogwai did it, no singing but in guitars, and sometimes human voices singing, keyboards sometimes, in 1997, 3 years after Hex, at the start of the new music, each guitar a wall and hammer, both. If we forgave ourselves for making what we have made, we would destroy what we have made before we'd let ourselves enjoy it. No, we won't release ourselves to joy with our forgiveness. Never. And so we build a tower from the top of which we hope to reach forgiveness. Opportunities for one to be unhappy are unlimited, a pitch of silence in the everyday unsounding. One's opportunities belong to one, but rogue unhappinesses claim their midsts in a consuming infinity that even now approaches yours. As Inya did it, though you didn't notice. Listen, the songs are hits, but listening, the sure connections between all things become long clouds. America, the sure connections fray in clouds at the Capitol, and those who scream they want you back have never seen you and wouldn't recognize you if you came. And those who lie face down on the floor in the chamber see the floor only. The woman on the other side of the door, wide-eyed and bleeding, sees no metaphors. Oh, music, where have you fled? Oh, music, who will make you new? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. You are welcome to unmute yourselves and just ask a question. I think one of the advantages of us not being in a webinar is that we can actually see each other. I have a question for Sadie and one for Shane, so I'll launch in if you're thinking about your own. Sadie, could you tell us more about Narrative 4? It sounds like a wonderful organization. So unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm pretty new to the facilitating of it, but I learned about it through another writer, Gerald Bork, who's a Louisiana writer, and he heard my spiel on sort of what I think about writing and compassion and vision in the world, and he thought that it would be a good fit for me. And it was started by Colin McCann, another writer, an Irish writer. It's all over the world. They mostly do work in schools and a lot of high schools as well. And what you do as a Narrative 4 facilitator is you ask people to spend some time, you pair off and you tell each other stories and your story. So you can kind of give prompts and then people give a story like what was a significant moment in your life, or something more specific sometimes, like can you talk about a time when you realize the importance of your family, things like that. And so people spend some time coming up with a story, and then they spend about 20 minutes sharing that story with their partner. And then the sort of radical thing that Narrative 4 does is it asks the partner to then rewrite the story, their partner's story, as their own, and to tell the story in the first person. So then they tell the story to the larger group in the first person. So they sort of get the experience of inhabiting and embodying another person. So sometimes Narrative 4 does really interesting things like this, like get together in communities of conflict. When they've had like police officers and high school students in neighborhoods where there's a lot of police aggression and police community conflict, they've had them get together and share each other's stories. And then another example is they've had people who, this is a pretty extreme one, you can find it online if you're interested in watching. They've had people who have had family victims of shootings and then pro-gun right activists as well. So it's pretty they don't shy away from anything. But the idea is that if we could really think about what it is to be in someone else's experience, then maybe we could get somewhere on some of these large scale conflicts.
So interesting. And how do people find, a venue or a place to join if they're interested?
Yeah, this is actually, since the pandemic, it's a super great time to do it because there's tons of virtual events. So anytime that you want to do it, I'll put the website in the chat. You can, right on the website, you can like click find a virtual event or sign up for one.
Okay. Cool. It makes me think of the human library that they have in Denmark a little bit, except better because the writing, the writing inhabits, the listener has to rewrite the story and inhabit it, not just listen to it. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And a question for Shane is, can you tell us, your work is so ambitious, even when you have short poems, they build. Can you say a few words about how you plot out books and hex, an amazing long poem, how you imagine the structures? Do they come to you ahead of time, while, after you've written part of it? Talk about structure. Please.
Structure in the thank you for that question. Structure in the sense of the individual poem, or in the sense of like a book?
In both. I mean, the books I've read,
Okay.
I haven't read every single one of your books, but the last three, I was interested in the way that Jim Limber stories interspersed with the speaker stories. And do you just write a bunch of poems and then see how they hold together, or do you write to a plan?
Sure. No, I don't write to a plan at all. I write a lot of poems. I write considerably more than I publish, and eventually I'll have what seems to me the sort of minimum for a book, about 60 pages or so, and then I'll start trying to put them in an order, and that's just kind of a lot of trial and error. Eventually they kind of start to make sense in a particular order, and then I'll end up usually writing more poems in the midst of this process, but there's at no point can I achieve anything like a plan. Eventually I can get a book to a place where I can look at it and it maybe makes sense, retrospectively. But no, I don't organize according to plan, and I definitely don't write according to any plan. I find that generally sort of detrimental.
Okay.
So yeah.
Good. Kim Johnson has a question.
Hi, I'm just unmuting myself. So Shane, I have a question for you. Obviously, you care a lot about music. There are a lot of shout outs in especially that long poem you read, to musical figures. I'm wondering if you can talk for a few minutes about how your own poems incorporate music, how the language of what is your strategy for getting music into your poems?
As in like into the sound of the poems itself, or like reference? Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, I only write really strictly metrical poems. And so I think in a lot of ways, there is a kind of wrestling, when you're writing metrical poems, there's a kind of wrestling going on with the form. And I think that a certain amount of energy, maybe a good amount of energy, is put into not making, put into resisting sing-songiness. I think that so if there's any music in the poetry at all, I suppose it probably arises out of that resistance. Otherwise, I wouldn't know. I like for things to sound good. I don't know if I'm capable of achieving things sounding good. And whatever musical effects I've ever noticed in my poems, I've noticed them after the fact. I've been surprised to discover them there. So it's probably mostly trying to resist the form I'm working in.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question?
I've got a question. Thank you both for those great readings. I've got a question for Sadie, though. I wanted to know what kind of research you put into Strange Children, and kind of what the process was before writing.
Sure. So when I started writing that book, it was a very voice-centered piece for me. So I started with the narratives of the sisters and was thinking I was writing short stories and didn't really think too much about it. And then I kept coming back to the community and it kept kind of growing. And then I thought, okay, maybe I'm writing a novella. And then finally I just gave in and decided to write the novel. But so when I made that decision, I realized I needed to do a lot of research, right? And to think about the way that I was building a fictional world, but that it had a correspondence in reality. And I wanted to think about that correspondence. And so the research was sort of, it was a lot of different things. It was reading books. I would definitely recommend, obviously, John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven, but even more so, Sam Brower's A Prophet's Prey, if people are interested in the subject. He's an investigator that helps people get out of polygamous communities. And then also testimonies of survivors, and then news articles, court testimonies, sermons of polygamous prophets, which got pretty dark and strange, polygamous doctrine as well. And then eventually I connected with what we refer to in popular culture as lost boys, which they don't really like that term, but young men that have been exiled from the community. And one of them offered very kindly to give me a tour of the Colorado City polygamous community down on the border of Utah and Arizona. He was at the time living in an abandoned motel outside of the town. He had been exiled several years before. And so he drove me around and sort of described everything in the community for me, all the buildings we were looking at, what his childhood was like. And, you know, in terms of the fiction that came from that, I know that landscape really well. And I was thinking a lot about the landscape, and I was thinking a lot about sort of the structures of these kinds of communities. But really from that particular research experience, the thing that struck me the most was how positive he was as a male growing up in that community, and how he just loved growing up in this rural, closed off place that felt very safe to him, which was obviously a very different experience than a lot of my narrators are having. But I thought that was super interesting to think about, just that we don't get to hear those kinds of positive stories very often. And the way that people experience their own lives versus how the media sort of makes it. So that was probably the most interesting part of the research.
Anyone else?
I
Yes.
have a question for Shane. I was just wondering what the context of like Lake Erie. It's a very long poem, the last hex poem that you read, and I was just wondering kind of like what your thought process of like having the lake, because I don't know, I grew up in that area and I wasn't sure if it was like geographically important or I don't know.
Well, I mean, to a large extent, there really wasn't any thought process. The writing of a poem, at least, I hope, and at least for me, it's an activity toward discovering one's thoughts. And so I don't really have a thought process going into it, or even while I'm doing it, except for to try to follow whatever thoughts I've already come across. So Lake Erie, I used to teach at Oberlin, and I would sometimes drive out to the lake. And my first winter there, when the lake was frozen and covered in snow, I went out there and took a picture, and I guess I just had never seen anything like it. The sort of infinite expanse of white, the flat white, endless distance. I guess I was seeing something unimaginable, though it hadn't occurred to me that such a thing was unimaginable, but there it was, the unimaginable before me. And I suppose that image of the flat white endless expanse kind of stuck in my mind. And so it shows up in poems sometimes.
Because there are a lot of students here, Shane, I'm going to ask you about law school and getting a law degree and then abandoning that and following the poetry path. Can you say a few words about why you went to law school and then why you decided not to practice law?
Sure. Why did I go to law school? I mean, my answer is not going to be very interesting, but I'll say it.
Because everybody expected you to.
No one expected me to.
No one did?
No one in my family had gone to college. I had spent my last years as a teenager and growing into an adult in a manufactured home. We didn't have really any money, and there was no reason for anyone. I mean, I had been failing school since the 6th grade, and then I dropped out of high school, and there was no reason for anyone to expect me to become a lawyer because we weren't lawyers. We weren't that kind of people. What happened was I did, for some reason, go to college. I got into college, and then I went to get my MFA. I went to Iowa, and this was early 2000s, and I guess when I got there, I still thought that maybe having an MFA would get me a job because I didn't know anything about getting a job. And then I realized as I was approaching the end of my time that I wasn't going to get a job with an MFA. I had kind of on and off very diffidently thought about law school before, because I really love logic games, and the LSAT is a lot of logic games, basically. And it's what determines whether you get in. And so because I really love logic games and always have, I thought I could do well in the LSAT. And so I took the LSAT, and I guess I did well. Eventually, Harvard called and said, you should apply to Harvard. And I said, okay. And which I wasn't going to do because I had no reason to think that Harvard would take me. But I applied, went to Harvard. I wanted to go to a place like Harvard, like in my wildest fantasy, I suppose, because there are very few law schools where the employment rate at graduation is essentially 100%. At Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and maybe sometimes somewhere like Columbia. But I thought, since I'm generally incompetent, if I go to a school where there's a 100% employment rate, I will get a job when I leave. And it's true, no matter how poorly you do at Harvard, how disinterested you are, someone will hire you because they, some law firm in Iowa that has literally no lawyers that went to Harvard once won, at least. And so I wanted to go back to Iowa City. I got a job at a Cedar Rapids corporate firm, but then I very quickly realized I didn't want to do the law at all. So I bombed the bar exam, and the firm didn't understand what was going on. Like, no one had ever failed it, which I take some pride in. No one at the firm had ever failed the bar exam, but I did. Then I stopped doing that, and I went back to, working retail. I worked in a factory for a while. I was a temp for a good long while. Eventually, I got to answering phones at various law firms, and then realized that if I wanted to teach, I would have to get a different graduate degree, a PhD, probably in lit. And so I started doing that, and then my first book came out. And so law school was not It was just the thing it turned out I could do, as opposed to a thing I really wanted to do.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have time for one or two more questions. Anybody?
I was wanting to ask Sadie a question. Being the professor that you are right now in creative writing, while you were reading, I just felt like the voice was so unique and so like just it wasn't you, you know. So I just wanted to know like how you got into that mindset. You mentioned research with I think Jake's question, but I just wanted to know like how you were able to sit down and just punch out somebody that was completely different from you.
Yeah, so I do get with that Anna Lou character, definitely the voice was in my head. So I was definitely thinking about it as an almost monologue of someone else speaking. So the choices I was making were coming from that space of thinking about how it would sound and the rhythms of the sentences. And they kind of drive people crazy, editors mostly, because they're really long and they're hard you got to kind of get into the rhythm so you know when to take a breath to read them out loud. And I think with that particular narrative and with the other ones as well, one of the things that drew me to writing from these kids' perspectives was thinking about the way in which when I was coming across like different sort of ceremonies, or even I watched a documentary during Sundance once called Sons of Perdition about exiled boys from the community. This like lilt that they had in their speech that was just, I'd never heard anything like it. And I was really interested in the way that in an isolated community, they have both the language of kind of being in a rural area, but they also have the language of the doctrines that they're hearing and the kinds of the intonations of that. So I was super interested in that. And then with this project too, the voices are really interesting because even though there's no narrative, that they're just telling their stories, the way they're telling their stories is really fascinating to me because I'm really interested in traditions of testimony and like bearing witness. And this is my side of the story. And this is how I form my identity within my community. And then the way that those different testimonies, when stacked up against each other, provide like a little bit of slippage and definitely make us realize that testimony does not equal truth. So all of that was super important to the narrative. But yeah, it's definitely like an inhabiting of that character when I sat down to write that particular piece.
Okay. Well, thank you. Your last chance to ask a question if you're burning with it. Otherwise, we'll call it a night. Thank you so much, Shane and Sadie, and thank all of you for coming. Our next reading is November 4th at Sura Riley. Take care.